I'm Nima Rajan, and this is Forum Daily Week in Review. Soaring prices in Canada have sparked comparisons between the current 8.1% inflation rate and the challenging high inflation of the 1970s and 80s. Canada suffered through years of high inflation after global events in the 1970s caused a surge in food and energy prices. Looking back, economists say the central bank was slow to raise interest rates back then, leading the economy into an eventual recession. Western University professor Dr. Stephen Williamson says the bank learned from that experience and recently raised its key interest rate by a full percentage point, which now sits at 2.5%. Well, joining us now to unpack this very comment is Dr. Williamson himself, a monetary policy expert and professor at the University of Western Ontario. Dr. Williamson, welcome to Forum Daily.
Yeah, thank you. Pleasure to be here.
So firstly, sir, can you unpack why the Bank of Canada raised its key interest rate by a full percentage point?
Well, the bank has an agreement with the federal government that it's had since 1991 to target inflation at 2%. And beginning last year, I mean, the inflation was above target. The bank's story back then was that that would be likely to be temporary, but now we have inflation, above 8%, and the bank's well behind the behind the curve now. And what they would like to do is make up for some lost ground. So that's why we have these unprecedentedly large interest rate increases. Very high rate of inflation, and they've been a little slow getting at it.
And we mentioned the high inflation of the 70s and 80s. So what sorts of mistakes did the central bank learn from back then?
Well, back then, it might be surprising to some people, but in the 1970s, it wasn't well recognized that inflation control was the job of the central bank. So we had an episode of like wage and price controls in Canada with the Anti-Inflation Board, and which didn't work very well, and ultimately we arrived at where the kind of working relationship we have now between the federal government and the Bank of Canada, which involves inflation targeting. Canada was one of the first countries to start doing that, and that was a big success for 30 years until last year.
All right, well, bringing this back to our viewers, Doctor, how is this rising interest rate likely to impact Canadians amid already rising inflation?
Well, the story here is that increases in interest rates they cut both ways. So they're bad for borrowers. You'll face a higher interest rate when you renew your mortgage or if you borrow to buy a car, but interest rates will be higher for savers. So this is like bad for younger people who borrow, and good for retired people who are interested in a safe rate of return.
All right, well, about 2 minutes left here, but there's been a lot of commentary about what the central bank should or should not be doing in terms of fighting inflation. But is there a simple solution to high inflation, Doctor?
Oh, there's never a simple solution. So the part of this is a matter of the bank being agile and watching the data and responding to it. So it could well be that inflation goes away on its own, but maybe not. And then the bank has to make judgments about how fast to increase rates and how high to go. But it's not a perfect science by any stretch of the imagination.
And do you expect any further rate hikes from the Bank of Canada?
Given current situation, yes. But again, it all depends how things unfold. There's some glimmer of hope here now because some commodity prices have begun to come down. Like price of oil, for instance. But the bank has to sit and wait and watch and see what happens, and it could be you're going to see more. Yeah.
Sounds like a lot to keep our eyes on. Dr. Williamson, thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily.
Okay, thank you.
Stay with us. After the break, we take a look at Arctic security in Canada amid warnings that Canada's north may be heating up amid rising Russian military activity in the region. We'll be speaking with Dr. Rob Hubert, Arctic security expert and associate professor at the University of Calgary, about the growing threats to Canada's Arctic from Russia and China and the UK's willingness to help. So stay with us. We'll be right back after a short break on Forum Daily Week in Review. Protecting Canada's Arctic has become a point of focus as threats from Russia and China continue to grow, and the UK seems to be willing to help. The United Kingdom is sending a military expert on Arctic threats posed by Russia and China to work in the British High Commission in Ottawa this September. The UK is dispatching Nick Diggle, a former Royal Navy officer and research specialist in Arctic security. The move follows a warning in March from Canada's defense chief that protecting Canada's Arctic region is a key concern for the armed forces. General Wayne Eyre warned that Russia has reoccupied abandoned Cold War bases in its far north, and he can't rule out a Russian incursion into Canada's Arctic from the north in the decades to come. Well, with us now to unpack the situation in the Arctic is Dr. Rob Hubert, associate professor at the University of Calgary and an Arctic security expert. Doctor, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Always my pleasure.
So in what ways can this Arctic expert from the UK assist Canada beyond its current capabilities?
Well, I don't know how much they're going to be assisting per se. I mean, I saw the press release, and I know that's the terminology that's using. I think that the deployment of this individual to Canada is really twofold. First of all, it's to underline the seriousness by which the British are taking this issue. Most Canadians won't be aware, but the British have actually just released an Arctic security policy paper. It's sort of talking about the way in which they see growing threats in the Arctic, what they want to be seeing in terms of trying to restore it to an area of peace and stability, and failing that, being able to respond to a threat. The second factor, of course, that flows from that is that the British are looking for ways of improving their Arctic and high north capabilities. And I suspect that this individual will be coming over to try to gain opportunities for British forces to train more with Canadian forces in the high Arctic.
And we mentioned General Wayne Eyre's warning that a Russian incursion from the north could potentially come in decades to come. So can you tell us a little bit more about how big of a threat Russia and China are in the region currently?
Well, we have to be really careful. What we're hearing from General Ayres and from other senior leaders is that really there isn't that much of a threat. If you listen carefully to some of their statements, they're saying that there is no immediate threat of a Russian invasion of any Canadian territory. Well, that's a bit of a red herring because it never was a issue since the beginning of the Cold War in terms of any Russian invasion. It's never been about land. It's always been about aerospace and maritime. And in fact, there's a very serious threat. We know that the Russians are developing both aerospace capabilities, hypersonics, and other related delivery systems of a very advanced nature, and new underwater delivery systems of both nuclear and non-nuclear payloads. And that is where the threat comes from. As we look for Russia becoming much more aggressive within the European context, should things really go bad in that particular theater, one of the real possibilities is that the Russians will try to make a move that extends into NATO, but before they would do so, they would try to either blind the Americans or take a significant part of the American offensive capabilities out. That means attacking the North American homeland, and that means attacking us as both a NATO ally and a NORAD ally.
Some very concerning developments on Russia's end there. So just for some further perspective for our viewers, what is the strategic significance of the Arctic for all players?
Well, I mean, we're seeing because of the geography of Russia and the fact that Russia has now become an aggressor state opposed to Western interests, we see the Arctic actually becoming one of the most dangerous strategic environments in the entire international system. It's a little bit out of sight, out of mind, and people say, okay, it's not really going to happen. But if the Russians were to make a move on the Americans at that level, or if the Americans make a misstep, it is going to be fought over the Arctic. Now, when I say over the Arctic, we're not fighting for territory. We're not fighting for the extended continental shelf or to land troops, but basically the engagement at the highest level will in fact be weapon systems that are either based in the Arctic or are moving to take out weapon systems based in the Arctic. And so this is the part that becomes so dangerous. The third factor that we haven't talked about, but we need to, is of course the reality that the Chinese are also building up their capabilities. Now, at this point, are they focused on having an Arctic war fighting capability? And most people are saying that they're not seeing anything yet. But you have to remember that China in 1990 had a defense budget that was less than Canada's. Once they made up their mind to become a major player, they now have the second largest defense budget at about 370 billion. And so one can't rule out an eventual entry of Chinese military capabilities, particularly nuclear-powered submarines, into that region.
Sounds like a lot of action to come in the Arctic. Lots to keep our eyes on. Dr. Hubert, thank you again for your time today.
Always my pleasure.
We'll be right back after the break. Stay with us. Industry experts say a shortage in mustard seeds is driving up prices, and it could leave some grocery shelves with low supply before the new harvest reaches markets this fall. France, the world's biggest consumer of mustard, is already facing shortages. Other countries are seeing prices climb as the stock of last year's mustard seeds are depleted. The problem is being caused by a drop in the number of acres of mustard seed planted last year on the Canadian prairies. This is where the majority of the world's mustard seeds are grown. That and a severe summer drought means crop yields are far lower than usual. All right, joining us now to talk more about this is Dr. Stuart Smythe, Associate Professor at the University of Saskatchewan and agri-food expert. Sir, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thank you, Nima.
So let's start with how this shortage is likely to impact Canadian consumers in grocery stores.
Yeah, so as you highlighted in the introduction, that the drop in production last year has reduced the availability of some of the mustard products. So I guess it depends on your level of consumption. If you're like me and you maybe buy 1 or 2 bottles a year, you probably won't notice a great deal of difference. But if you're going through a bottle a month or every couple of months, you'll likely have noticed that there's fewer options or fewer availability, which may last into the fall, into winter even.
Now, considering that Canada is a major supplier of mustard seeds, in fact, we mentioned the majority of the world's mustard seeds are grown in the prairies, how is the shortage impacting the industry, supply chains, and profits?
So because the yield was down so much last year, the mustard manufacturers have a little bit less supply than they would have previously. So that's driven up prices, which has pushed up acres. Farmers planted about 40% more mustard than they would, say, over the past 10 years. So if the weather holds sort of till the end of August, first part of September, we should begin to see that some of those prices start to ease as harvest begins and supplies begin to increase.
And as you mentioned, farmers, can you tell us a little bit more about how farmers are being impacted by this shortage?
Yeah, not so much that they're going to be impacted as a consumer, but the rise in prices has certainly allowed them to have another crop option that has significant higher prices. The price of some varieties of mustard seed is over 3 times higher than it was at this time last year. So farmers typically plant based on price and crop rotations, and mustard obviously has been an attractive alternative for a lot of farmers this summer.
And is there any way that maybe the mustard sector can expand in Canada?
Yeah, I think it could, Nima, that, with some of the advances within biotech and the potential to increase traits like drought resistance and yield can certainly contribute to the opportunity for farmers to increase their number of acres that they have, normally produced, as I said, sort of in that 400,000 acre range. And it would be great to see it move up to double.
It would be great to see that, definitely. Now, what are you watching ahead of the fall harvest? I know there's a lot of hopes for this fall harvest coming up.
Yeah, the main thing is that, the weather patterns we've had over the last month or so with some fairly frequent rains, and if we get another couple of weeks of that, and then we get some nice warm weather through September, October, we should get really good harvest conditions. And when I looked about 10 days ago, the provincial Ministry of Agriculture was listing about 85 to 90% of the mustard acres in Saskatchewan as fair and above. So that would sort of align with at least being on average with the last 10 years. So fingers crossed we get that kind of weather, and we should have normal, if not above normal yields going into the winter Christmas season kind of thing.
All right, and as you mentioned weather, so I want to stay on that point. So we mentioned severe drought also had an impact on the mustard seed production. What other threats does climate change or severe weather pose to the food sector in particular?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the variability in weather patterns certainly can have an influence through the droughts we experienced last year. High winds can certainly flatten crops and greatly contribute to reduced yields. The other thing that happens with changing weather patterns is insect and plant disease expand. So we would expect to see an increase of plant diseases that might commonly be in the United States, or insects that are commonly in the United States, and their range of survivability would begin to move further north into Canada, which would increase the cost for farmers having to control for both of those factors.
All right, Dr. Smythe, thank you for an informative interview.
My pleasure. Have a great afternoon.
China is warning it will respond forcefully if U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi proceeds with a planned visit to Taiwan. Beijing objects to all official contact between Taipei and Washington, but this time the stakes appear to be higher. Meanwhile, Taiwan's capital is staging air raid drills, and its military is mobilizing for routine exercises in response to China's threats. Ms. Pelosi has not confirmed when or even if she'll visit, but U.S. President Joe Biden last week told reporters that American military officials believed such a trip was not a good idea. Well, with us now is Mr. Bradley Bowman, Senior Director of the Center on Military and Political Power at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Mr. Bowman, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So from the sounds of this, there are a lot of risks associated with this visit, Mr. Bowman. So what is the strategic significance of this visit for the United States in particular, if it were to go through?
The strategic significance is that Beijing wants to extinguish democracy in Taiwan. And as part of the process to do that, it wants to isolate Taipei as much as possible politically and diplomatically. And so that's one of the reasons why I, for one, have long thought that it's wise for members of Congress to go to Taiwan to say that we stand with the free people there as they seek to defend their freedoms. And we've seen what happened already to freedom in Hong Kong. And so if you have the Speaker of the House of Representatives, second in line to the president, visiting Taiwan, that's a very significant thing from both the Taiwanese perspective and from the perspective of the Chinese Communist Party. And, in the past, Beijing would complain, they'd issue harshly worded diplomatic communiques, but now they have the military power to potentially back it up. And that's what makes this a little bit more concerning.
And on that point, what do you think China means when it said it would respond forcefully? What would that look like for both the United States and Taiwan?
I think they're being deliberately vague, as is often the case and when one's making threats, because the one issuing the threat doesn't want to constrain themselves. They want to leave their options open. But the goal is to instill fear. And the question is whether the United States and Speaker Pelosi will back down. At this point, I would say, if she didn't go, that would send a horrible precedent that Beijing, more directly the Chinese Communist Party, has a veto over who visits Taiwan. And I think that would be very unfortunate.
And in addition to the threats from China, we also mentioned Joe Biden's remarks about it not being a good idea, according to military officials. So how likely is Ms. Pelosi to visit Taiwan here?
I, as someone who used to work in the Senate and traveled on staff delegations and organized trips for members of Congress and traveled with them on some of those, they're getting briefings from the Department of Defense. They're getting briefings from our intelligence community. Speaker Pelosi and her team are going to have all the information they need to make this decision. But the bottom line, if she goes, is it's going to be the job of the U.S. government to protect her, and it would be very unwise for Beijing to challenge this approach. But this really is becoming quite a high stakes test of will and perhaps a test of strength. And I hope it doesn't come to that. But, we've seen what happens arguably in Ukraine when we allow bullies to have their way. And I think Beijing is trying to bully us, and we shouldn't let them.
So we mentioned what Joe Biden said, but how are other lawmakers in Washington responding to this potential visit?
It's interesting. Things are so partisan and sadly tribalistic at times these days in Washington, D.C. But here's an instance where you have a lot of Republicans, almost all Republicans, coming out in support of Speaker Pelosi, the leader of the Democratic Party in the House of Representatives. The reaction among Democrats is a little bit more mixed, but you have people like Chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, Adam Smith, supporting her and her desire to go there. So I'd say generally strong support for her right to go and for her going, particularly among Republicans, but generally also among Democrats as well.
All right, Mr. Bowman, just about a minute left here, but what are you watching for if this visit were to go ahead?
I think the thing for Americans, Canadians, and others to watch here is that the balance of power in East Asia has eroded. And, 10, 20 years ago, it's like we all kind of knew that Beijing wouldn't mess with the United States. That has changed now. And that's why it's more important than ever that we work with our allies to restore deterrence so that Beijing continues to issue strong communiques, but it doesn't back it up with military force. But if we allow this erosion to continue, the day may come where it'll be more than words that we see in an instance like this.
Lots to keep our eyes on. Mr. Bowman from FDD, thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily.
Thank you.
All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at important conversations from this week. Thanks for joining us on Forum Daily Week in Review, and we'll see you again next time. Take care, Canada.